as a young boy the depth of her work that she was doing?
I knew a fair bit of it, mainly because she'd come back with all these stories and full of excitement and just passion for what she'd been doing.
In a deep Britain woke up on the 1st of July with one date circled quietly in the back of a nation's mind. It was not a coronation, not a wedding, not a jubilee. It was the birthday of a woman who has been gone for nearly 3 decades and yet who somehow still feels present every single year this date rolls around. Princess Diana would have turned 65. 65 is not a young number. It is retirement, grandchildren, slower mornings, and the kind of quiet contentment that a life well lived is supposed to earn. Diana never got any of that. She never got to grow old. And that single fact is why this particular birthday landed differently than the ones before it. Why people who were not even born when she died found themselves thinking about a stranger they only know through photographs and documentaries, and why Prince William's choices on this day were watched more closely than almost anything else he has done all year. So what actually happened? Not the rumor, not the speculation, but the parts of the day that were seen, documented, and confirmed. And underneath that, what did it mean for a son who was 15 years old when he lost his mother in the most public tragedy of the modern royal era, and who is now a 44-year-old father trying to decide what her memory should look like going forward? The public part of the day took place not in London, but in Scotland, at St. Giles's Cathedral in Edinburgh, where the Order of the Thistle service was held. This is one of the oldest and most tradition-bound ceremonies in British royal life, and William attended in his capacity as the Duke of Rothesay, the title he holds north of the border. He walked in wearing the deep green velvet robes and the black hat crowned with white ostrich feathers that mark members of the order, arriving alongside his uncle, Prince Edward, ahead of King Charles and Queen Camilla, who were welcomed with a royal salute and the national anthem. It was formal. It was steeped in centuries of protocol, and on paper, it had nothing to do with Diana at all, except that everyone in that cathedral, and everyone watching the footage afterward, understood the coincidence sitting underneath the ceremony. This was the same date that would have been Diana's 65th birthday, and her eldest son was standing in the robes of an institution she once described as suffocating, on the anniversary of the day she was born into a life she never fully chose for herself. Outside the cathedral, a small group of anti-monarchy protesters held signs and chanted against the institution altogether. A reminder that not everyone in Britain views these ceremonies with the same reverence. But inside, William's presence carried a quieter kind of tension, a son fulfilling the duties of the family that both shaped him and, in his mother's case, ultimately failed to protect her. There was no formal mention of Diana built into the day's official program. No plaque was unveiled. No royal statement was issued referencing her birthday directly, and that absence of ceremony is, in its own way, part of the story. The palace did not orchestrate a tribute. If anything meaningful happened on this day, it happened because William chose to make it happen, not because an institution scheduled it for him. In the days surrounding the anniversary, William turned attention toward Homewards, the homelessness initiative he founded through his Royal Foundation back in 2023. The program has now passed its 3rd year, and its stated goal has always been ambitious in its simplicity: to make homelessness in the United Kingdom rare, brief, and never repeated. It currently operates across 6 regions of the country, and reporting indicates the Associated Homewards Fund has distributed roughly £2.6 million to support local projects tackling housing insecurity. William traveled to Aberdeen in the days before the anniversary to meet with people involved in the initiative and discuss strategy directly with those doing the work on the ground. This was not a red carpet appearance. It was closer to a working visit, the kind that does not always make the front page but reflects where William has chosen to spend his time and political capital as a senior royal. The connection to Diana here is not speculation. William has said publicly, on more than one occasion, that his mother was the reason he first came face to face with homelessness as a child. She was known for taking her sons to shelters and introducing them to people whose circumstances were nothing like their own. A decision that was unusual for a royal parent at the time, and that clearly left a mark. Diana's instinct was that titles and privilege should never become a wall between her children and the reality other people lived. Decades later, her son has built an entire foundation around the same instinct, and marking her birthday by highlighting that work rather than by holding a ceremony in her name feels like a deliberate choice about what kind of tribute actually matters to him. The Order of the Thistle service was not the only moment this year where William chose to let his mother's memory surface. Back in March, on Mother's Day in the United Kingdom, he shared a previously unreleased photograph taken at the family's Highgrove home in 1984. It shows him as a small child standing in a field of flowers, holding his mother's hand. Alongside it, he wrote a short message thanking people for remembering those they loved on that day and noting that he thinks of his mother today and every day. That photograph had never been made public before, which matters more than it might initially seem. Diana's image has been circulated, sold, printed, and reprinted for nearly 30 years. To the point where it can be easy to forget that most of what the public has seen of her was filtered through magazines, documentaries, and news coverage rather than through her son's own private collection. Choosing to release an image that had stayed inside the family for over 4 decades is a different kind of gesture than attending a ceremony. It says, in effect, that some of what William chooses to share of his mother will come from him directly, on his own timeline, rather than from an archive someone else controls. Notably, there was no accompanying family photo released this year showing William, Kate, and their children together, which had been a tradition around Mother's Day in recent years. That absence followed the controversy from 2024, when a family photo posted to mark the occasion was found to have been digitally altered, prompting Kate to issue a rare public apology acknowledging the editing. Whether this year's quieter approach was a deliberate response to that episode or simply a scheduling choice is not something that has been confirmed, but it does mean that the 1984 photograph of William and his mother stood on its own, without competition from a newer image of the family he has built since. One of the more understated threads running through William's approach to Diana's memory involves his own 3 children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. None of them ever had the chance to meet their grandmother, and all of what they know about her necessarily comes secondhand through photographs, documentaries, news coverage, and whatever their father chooses to tell them directly. Royal commentators have long noted that William is protective of how his children come to understand Diana, preferring that her story reach them through family memory rather than exclusively through the version of her that exists in tabloids and television specials. There is nothing unusual in a parent wanting to be the one who introduces their children to a grandparent's memory, particularly when that grandparent's public image has been shaped by so much outside noise for so many decades. What is unusual is the scale of public fascination that still surrounds Diana, which means William is navigating something more complicated than an ordinary family conversation. He is trying to give his children a private relationship with someone the rest of the world feels they already know. Princess Charlotte, in particular, has drawn attention from royal watchers given that she shares her grandmother's name in spirit, if not directly, and given how visibly present Diana's influence remains in discussions of the younger generation of royals. As Charlotte and her brothers get older, it would not be surprising if their curiosity about their grandmother grows alongside them. And how William chooses to answer that curiosity privately and without cameras present may end up being one of the more lasting parts of how Diana's story is carried forward. That said, specific details of those family conversations have not been made public, and much of what circulates about them remains speculation rather than confirmed reporting. There is one story about William and Diana that predates all of this, and that resurfaces almost every time the anniversary of her birth or death comes around. In 1996, after Diana's divorce from Charles was finalized, she lost the style of Her Royal Highness, a change that was more than symbolic to her. According to an account from her former butler, Paul Burrell, Diana was deeply hurt by the loss of that title, feeling it stripped away part of who she had been within the family. William, only 14 at the time, saw how much it affected her and reportedly told her not to worry, that he would give the title back to her one day when he became king. He never got the chance. Diana died in a car crash in Paris the following year, and the promise a heartbroken teenager made to comfort his mother became one of the more quietly devastating footnotes in the story of their relationship. William cannot restore a royal style to someone no longer alive to hold it, and no amount of ceremony can undo what happened in 1997. But there is an argument, made by many who have followed his life closely, that he has kept the spirit of that promise in a different form. Rather than restoring a title, he has spent his adult life protecting the things that mattered more to her than any formal designation ever did. Her compassion, her instinct to sit with people the world tends to overlook, and her refusal to let her children grow up unaware of how most people actually live. Anniversaries of Diana's death have always carried a particular weight, but birthdays hit differently, and this one in particular carried an unusual kind of grief because of what the number represented. 65 is not a tragic age. It is an ordinary one, the kind attached to retirement parties and family gatherings rather than headlines. For a woman who has been frozen in public memory at 36, imagining her at 65 means imagining an entire life she never got to live. Watching her sons marry, meeting 5 grandchildren, growing older alongside a family that has changed enormously since 1997. That imagined life is part of what made this particular anniversary resonate beyond the usual circle of royal commentary. People who have no particular investment in the monarchy as an institution still found themselves thinking about what a 65-year-old Diana might have looked like at a christening, or what she might have said to Charlotte about growing up in the public eye, or how she might have handled the pressures her granddaughter-in-law Kate has faced. None of that can ever be known. All that remains is the version of her that stopped when she was 36, and the version of her legacy that her sons and grandchildren continue to shape without her. Diana never got a grand official monument that fully captures how people remember her, and in some ways that has always suited the way her legacy actually survives. She is remembered less for any single object built in her name, and more for a set of instincts she modeled in public at a time when few royals did, sitting beside AIDS patients and shaking their hands without gloves when public fear around the illness was still enormous, walking through active minefields in Angola to draw attention to civilians harmed by war, and treating hospital visits and shelter stops not as photo opportunities, but as places she actually wanted to be. Those instincts did not disappear with her. They surface in William's continued commitment to homelessness work, in the quieter ways he tries to shape how his children understand compassion, and in the deliberate choice, seen again this year, to mark her birthday through action rather than ceremony. Whether that amounts to keeping a promise made by a grieving 14-year-old, or simply reflects the kind of father and public figure William has grown into on his own terms, is something people will likely keep debating for as long as Diana's story continues to matter to the public. What does seem clear is that this year, on a date that could easily have passed with nothing more than a passing mention in the news cycle, William chose to let his mother's memory shape how he spent his time, who he stood beside, and what he chose to share with the country that has never quite stopped grieving her. It is worth pausing on exactly what the Order of the Thistle represents, because the ceremony itself is not something most people outside Scotland think about very often. It is Scotland's highest order of chivalry, older than almost any other honor the monarchy bestows, reserved for a small number of individuals chosen personally by the sovereign. The annual service at St. Giles's Cathedral is steeped in ritual. The robes, the feathered caps, the procession, the salute, all of it designed to project continuity, an unbroken line stretching back centuries. For William, attending in his role as the Duke of Rothesay places him inside that continuity in a very literal sense. It is one of the titles that marks him as heir, not just to the British throne broadly, but to a specifically Scottish royal identity that predates the union of the crowns. There is a strange symmetry in a son who lost his mother to the pressures of an institution she eventually stepped back from, now standing at the center of one of that institution's oldest and most tradition-bound rituals on the exact date that would have been her birthday. Nobody scheduled it that way on purpose. The Order of the Thistle service happens on the same date every year, regardless of who is born or who has died. But the coincidence is the kind that tends to get noticed by a public that has spent almost 3 decades looking for signs of Diana in the choices her sons make. Outside the cathedral walls, the small group of protesters holding anti-monarchy signs is a reminder that not every part of Britain experiences these ceremonies the same way. Some see continuity and dignity in the pageantry. Others see an institution that, for all its recent efforts at modernizing, still asks its members to perform loyalty to tradition over almost everything else. The same tension that shaped so much of Diana's own difficult relationship with royal life. William's attendance does not resolve that tension. If anything, it puts it on quiet display, a son fully inside the machinery his mother eventually could not reconcile herself to. Diana's birthday has not always been marked publicly in a consistent way. In some years, it has passed with little more than passing mentions in royal reporting. In others, family members have made small gestures, an Instagram post, a mention in an interview, a quiet visit to a cause connected to her memory. What made this particular year stand out was less any single dramatic gesture and more the accumulation of smaller ones landing in the same window of time. The Aberdeen visit ahead of the anniversary, the Order of the Thistle appearance falling on the date itself, and the Mother's Day photograph from earlier in the year that had already put Diana back into public conversation months before her birthday arrived. Taken individually, none of these moments would necessarily generate much conversation. A working visit to discuss a housing initiative is a fairly ordinary part of William's calendar at this point in his public life. Attending a Scottish chivalric ceremony is a duty he performs most years regardless of the calendar date. But when a milestone birthday, a significant one, 65, the kind that would ordinarily be marked with a party rather than a memorial, lines up with these otherwise routine activities, the public tends to read intention into the timing even when the palace has not explicitly confirmed one. Whether that reading is entirely fair to William, or whether it says more about how hungry the public remains for any connection to Diana, is worth considering. People have spent nearly 30 years parsing every gesture her sons make for hidden meaning, and it is worth asking how much of that meaning is actually there, and how much is projected onto them by a public that still has not fully let her go. No discussion of how Diana's memory is being carried forward can really avoid the more complicated part of the story, which is that her 2 sons have taken quite different paths in how publicly and how often they speak about her. William has largely kept his references to his mother contained to specific moments, an anniversary, a photograph, a cause connected to her memory, generally without extensive commentary attached. Harry, by contrast, has spoken and written about Diana far more openly and at far greater length, including in his memoir and in various interviews, often connecting her death directly to his own experiences with grief, media intrusion, and his decision to step back from royal duties. Those 2 approaches are not necessarily in conflict with each other, but they do mean the public receives 2 very different pictures of how her sons process losing her. William's version tends to come through institutional channels and charitable work, filtered through the more restrained public communication style that has generally defined his approach to royal life. Harry's version has been more personal and more direct, and at times more openly critical of how the family and the press handled both Diana's life and the aftermath of her death. The fact that 2 brothers who once walked behind the same coffin together as children have grown into adults who honor their mother in such different registers says something about how grief does not move in a single direction, even within the same family. It is worth taking a closer look at what Homewards has accomplished in its 3 years of existence, because the initiative is often mentioned in passing without much detail about what it does day to day. The program operates in 6 locations across the United Kingdom, each one working with local authorities, businesses, and charities to build coordinated responses to homelessness rather than relying on a single national policy imposed from above. The Homewards Fund, which has distributed roughly £2.6 million since the program's founding, supports smaller organizations doing frontline work, from emergency shelter provision to programs helping people transition.